Nathan Fielder is one of our great narcissists. I think he would be the first to admit that, and his work has seemingly revolved around proving it and apologizing for it. He's made a career of injecting himself into situations where he doesn't belong, and the more he wallows in the destruction he's caused, the more he invariably pushes the form. This was true of Nathan For You, where his harebrained schemes jeopardized real businesses and made real people the butt of his jokes. It was true of The Rehearsal, where he took this framework a step further and attempted to control every aspect of his subjects' lives, and eventually his own, on a crusade to curate his own emotional journey rather than have one organically. And now it's true of The Curse, his collaboration with co-creator Benny Safdie and co-star Emma Stone, which sees their characters, Asher and Whitney Siegel, single-handedly spearheading the gentrification of Espanola, New Mexico. As the show was being developed, it was pitched as a genre-bending half-hour comedy, which eventually became an hour-long drama. According to Safdie, it didn't change much from initial conception to the final product, but I have some suspicion that the concept originally took place more within Fielder and Stone's fictional HGTV show, leaving the satire up to the audience to parse from within it. This is pure speculation on my part, and what we wound up with is a more straightforward narrative series, but that doesn't mean it doesn't find new ways to push the form within this more conventional framework. My initial impression that the show would be more HGTV focused was mainly rooted in Fielder's history of pushing the reality TV medium. Even How To with John Wilson, which he produced, spends its penultimate episode waxing poetic about how much of these so-called documentaries are really made up and curated, and how we'll never really know the full truth. The Curse still toes the line of documentary and fiction, but more so as a piece of neo-realism, lingering on supposed non-actors to capture their real essence and apply it to the fully fictional world, including this reference to Killer of Sheep, rather than as a reality TV riff. But the genre-defying claim still tracks. Despite the satire and awkward cringe comedy, the show draws a great deal from horror, with its slow zooms and unsettling synth score, and eventually delves into surrealism. The very notion of the curse, which Hikmah Warsami's Nala casts on the Siegels, is a source of underlying horror and conflict for the characters, and the filmmaking constantly plays a guessing game with us to make us wonder if the supernatural really is possible in this world. This is imbued with the kind of satanic energy you'd find in The Exorcist, which unsurprisingly was also tapped into in the Safdie's Uncut Gems. Of course, the curse really just amounts to the consequences of the Siegels' actions, doing everything in their power to pretend they're not ruining Espanola by turning it into a hip downtown area and displacing the locals. If this wasn't obvious from just, everything that happens, including Nala's own admission that the curse was just a TikTok trend, then the moment that cements it is Safdie's character Dougie relating to Asher, blaming a curse for his wife's death, which happened when he got in a DUI accident.
I happened to be drunk that night. Nothing makes sense.
But the subjectivity of the characters, spouting their politically correct teachings but still harboring deep biases towards the non-white Espanola locals, and especially its indigenous community, comes through in these moments of what if.
When you saw that little girl and you thought that she could actually do curses, I could have definitely accused you of something.
And as the locals play pranks on the Siegels by over-mystifying themselves to the point of parody, so too does the camera. This mindset also accounts in general for the paranoid, borderline surveillance-style framing that makes up the show's visual language. The quote-unquote important information is always like 60% cropped into the frame. The camera, which seems to have a life of its own, is constantly contextualizing Whitney and Asher as an infection within their environment, voyeuristically framing them as the cultural voyeurs they really are, and going to great lengths to dirty the frame with film grain emulation, shallow focus that isn't even always able to capture them both at the same time, and layers of environment boxing them in. Regular dialogue coverage often seems to be shot from 50 feet away in another room through windows, and they embrace the artifacts that come with this shooting style. The camera at times will reframe, and will linger on the reframing longer than on the subject once the camera actually settles, and there's apparently no regard for the camera car's interior dipping into frame while shooting the picture car. This embrace of the boundaries of the medium genuinely reminds me of the use of jump cuts in Breathless. The audience either doesn't notice or doesn't care that so blatant a reminder that this is a fake, filmed thing is bleeding into the frame. But more importantly, it emphasizes the environment and even the neo-realist elements of the show. I think my favorite use of this extreme frame dirtying, we'll call it, is when Whitney and Asher are talking next to their neighbor's house, and we zoom so far out that we're actually actually in the neighbor's living room, watching her watch TV. I believe the neighbor even looks into the camera eventually, so as to communicate to the audience whose perspective the camera really sympathizes with. Neorealism is more Safdie's MO than Fielder's, so it's a little ironic that Fielder directed 7 of the 10 episodes, while Safdie, who plays the director in the show, didn't direct any. But this practice is still in conversation with both co-creators' bodies of work, primarily their use of non-actors in street casting and the potential exploitation that comes with it. And in Benny Safdie's case, the release of this show has coincided with the official announcement of his divorce from brother Josh Safdie. Many have read his character Dougie to be inspired in part by Josh, and if we were to track the show's focus on crossing ethical lines in the name of filmmaking and burying stories to its most extreme real-life counterpart, then we'd have to reckon with the Good Time controversy, in which an underage girl was coerced into doing a scene naked. I can't stress enough how sensitive of a subject this is, one that certainly deserves more discussion than I believe the scope of this video justifies. But I believe Benny is just as reproachable as Josh for not commenting on that situation, other than announcing they're cutting ties with Sebastian Bear-McClard, the producer primarily responsible for the incident, and likely another person Benny's channeling into Dougie. He and Josh were notably quiet about the whole situation when it came to light, and if this is his way of reckoning with that experience, then I think it's genuinely an insidious and cowardly way of going about it. I obviously don't have enough information there to be commenting with any authority. Of course, I want to believe it was only Bear-McClard who was aware of this happening, and again, this is a much bigger can of worms than I should be opening as an aside here. But I bring it up because A, it's so closely connected to the subtext of this show that it's hard for me not to think about it in regards to Safdie's other artistic intentions here, and B, for this very reason, I don't think Benny's just strawmanning his brother. I think he's channeling himself at least as much as he is Josh, on top of a number of other people he's encountered, as well as various made-up character concepts. If they had addressed the controversy sooner and more thoroughly, then I wouldn't feel the need to be so moralistic about it as it pertains to the curse, or feel that it was something to separate from my reading of the show. But as is, it exists as a sort of elephant in the room when I think about everything else going on here. Pivoting back to genre and neorealism though, I think as a directorial effort, the series being more narrative-driven as opposed to blending reality and fiction still is largely a logical progression for Fielder. For one, the liberty of working with a piece of fiction allows him the freedom to actually construct a fully developed world, as he's tried so tirelessly to do in the rehearsal. This is reinforced by the fact that the world he builds with this show is one in which his character fruitlessly attempts to build a world of his own within Espanola, and causes nothing but harm, giving the whole thing a quality of snake eating its own tail. He's also afforded new ways to emasculate himself and continue his project of self-loathing, from Asher's micropenis to the motif of distorted mirrors, which take on a number of meanings regarding the show's cultural and environmental commentary, as well as the 3 leads' sinister motivations. This shot is a particular standout moment, as Fielder, by writing, directing, and starring in it, quite literally places himself in front of the mirror and decides exactly how much he wants to distort himself. In other words, demonstrating the agency he has in curating his pathetic self-image. I'm aware of the heavy-handed nature of using a mirror as a motif for something that's meant to hold a mirror to society, but I think the sheer number of registers it works on here makes up for the face value heavy-handedness. The passive homes with their reflective exteriors are almost invisible, but are only so by repurposing the image of everything around them. This is what Whitney and Asher hope to accomplish literally by building these homes, and metaphorically as they embed themselves into this town and appropriate native art, hoping the obvious consequences of their socioeconomic infiltration will go unnoticed. Never is this appropriation more clear than when Whitney designs a Pueblo-style passive home with the mirrors. This cultural commentary is the show's bread and butter for most of its runtime, dropping us in increasingly uncomfortable situations where Whitney and Asher condescend to their neighbors. This is where Stone in particular shines, managing an impossible balance of self-denial and sincere interest in doing good, ultimately coming off as patronizing and at times psychotic, somehow both human and uncannily alien. Though I do have to commend the sheer terror that comes from Fielder's uncharacteristic rage in certain moments. The Seagulls go somewhat beyond the typical platitude-heavy liberal stereotype you get in this kind of satire, attempting to perform some kind of actual praxis, the kind likely learned from infographics or other disposable social media posts. Their motivations for doing so are certainly flimsy. Whitney out of a desire to be perceived as a gifted and important artist, as well as to counteract the guilt over her slumlord parents, whose slumlordery she simultaneously relies on to fund her endeavor, and Asher mainly out of subservience to Whitney. But they do take the extra steps here and there, to the point where it can seem at times like the show is criticizing leftist ideology and even playing into right-wing talking points, such as in a B-plot where Whitney offers to pay for anything shoplifted from her store out of pocket rather than calling the cops, which the locals immediately exploit. But what's really going on here is showcasing the paradox of trying to ethically gentrify. Whitney and Asher are forced to confront the inevitability that treating the symptom isn't treating the disease, and leftist social reform is impossible to achieve by still operating within a hyper-capitalist status quo, through more business and real estate development that necessitates parasitic practices. In other words, by committing themselves only to the naive optics of doing good and ostensible reform, they'll never realize that pursuing their self-interests is directly sabotaging their wimpy attempts at philanthropy. This is partly an idea that Nathan For You revolved around, as Fielder attempted to fix each business, again only treating the symptom. But where that show, in its roundabout way, celebrated the individual people involved in each scheme, The Curse is much more interested in watching the disease fester and showcasing just how much evil is possible in doing good. In Whitney and Asher's case, the lesson is that the only thing that can stop a bad landlord is not, in fact, just a good landlord. The show isn't exactly a socialist call to arms, but it demonstrates that our material reality is a lot more complicated than these aspiring white saviors think it is, to say the least. The show's structure emphasizes this cultural disconnect. Episode 1 plays out as a pretty conventional narrative, setting up the stakes and the characters and the language of the show, but then every subsequent episode lets this structure hang a little loose, and mostly consists of a small handful of drawn-out scenes, some of which contribute to a tight A or B plot, but most of which exist in a vacuum to hammer away the show's themes and expand upon the various character studies, especially anything to do with Dougie. The show still mostly follows an accessible, linear through line, and every major thread gets some sort of conclusion, but the reason this loose structure works becomes clear in the finale. Now, the finale is the kind of episode that, like Twin Peaks: The Return Part 8, makes people talk about it like the rest of the show doesn't exist and wasn't already great. This is in part because it is effectively a separate short film, an epilogue after Whitney and Asher hash things out in episode 9, and we see the bleak conclusion of what happens best case scenario if their show works out, which also sneaks in a jab at streaming that I feel compelled to mention only because I had to watch this show by getting and subsequently canceling a Paramount Plus subscription. But despite it more or less working on its own as a standalone film, you do get the sense that the rest of the show was built around the sheer whiplash of getting to this point, of providing context for this moment to feel just as much of a departure from reality as it is. As someone who just put out a video pedantically analyzing what I do and don't consider surrealism in regards to the other big Emma Stone work that just came out, I'm happy to decree that this episode is a piece of proper surrealism, which contradicts our understanding of the natural order of the world and its own world, and plays out logistically in a way that only makes sense on an emotional level. And I must emphasize, it does make sense on an emotional level. For one, it's Fielder's final act of emasculation and infantilization. Not only is Asher ousted from Earth, but we're to understand that he's simultaneously being reborn as his own child. If not literally, then on some symbolic level. There are frequent indicators foreshadowing this throughout the show, and the passive home is constantly referred to as a thermos, which has contributed to the slowly boiling tension of the show, but it's also effectively an incubator, or more specifically a womb. The pressure cooker physics are posited as an explanation for gravity flipping, even if there more likely isn't an actual explanation. But I believe this faux diagnosis really serves the purpose of getting us to associate, on some level, the interior of the house with the gestation that's occurring with Asher and their child. We get a few more attempts at literally explaining what's going on, which also are not to be taken at face value completely, but contribute to understanding subconsciously what Fielder's getting at. It's partly representing Asher's incompatibility with Whitney, Fielder having gone through a divorce himself, but most notable is Dougie accusing him of running away from his paternal responsibilities. It's worth noting that of the two, Safdie's the one who's recently become a father, and by his own account, it was watching HGTV in the hospital that the subject of the show came to him, so I'm sure this is largely him voicing his own concerns about parenting. But what stands out more to me is that the rehearsal also slowly becomes about parental anxiety, concluding its first season with a supposed breakthrough regarding fatherhood that Fielder has either actually achieved or simply performed. The notion that he's once again commandeering a show that was originally about one thing and making it about fatherhood seems to me like a formal act of self-insertion. The kind of insertion into businesses and people's lives and small towns his work has always revolved around. the apparent narcissism he always seems to be apologizing for. One can't ignore the visual similarities between Fielder being reborn as a baby and being shot into space, and the evolution of the space baby in 2001. Maybe this is just a nod, maybe it's a lofty parallel to draw from a Nathan Fielder show, but I think it demonstrates that this is not just infantilization. Fielder clearly thinks himself at worst as someone unfit to interact with other people, unfit to raise a child, and unfit to be on this planet. After all, Whitney seems to forget about Asher completely as soon as the baby's born. But I think the ultimate revelation here is that regression and emasculation, which he performs by making these shows and painting himself as a pathetic villain, is the only means of rebirth and evolution he really has, the only way of reckoning with himself and these shortcomings. And as painful as it is for us to experience at times, I believe we're all the better for it. That's it from me this time around. As always, you can find my links in the description, Patreon, and all that. I've actually got some new stuff going on Patreon pretty soon. I'll probably make a formal announcement one of these days, but if you're curious, you can go check out what's brewing over there. Until then, thanks for watching, and goodbye.